So I have one question. Raul asked, why do we not respond relative to the magnitude of the threat? And I throw the question out to you. When you see data like that, what do you find yourself doing? How do you feel? I'll ask what psychologist asks. How does that make you feel? As somebody who was trained as a clinical psychologist, I became interested several years ago in the possibility that the types of emotional responses and consequent behavioral reactions that we study in individuals may apply to populations of individuals that share common experience. For example, in psychology, we know very well that when people are faced with a perception of uncontrollable threat, and the sense that they don't have at their disposal an easy way to deal with it, they get very anxious. And anxiety directly predicts avoidance behavior. Avoidance, even of information that reminds you of the anxiety. And that information might be something that may actually be a very adaptive action. We will avoid it. Can those responses be true of whole populations of people? And can psychology help with that? And interestingly, I think probably in many of our minds, psychology doesn't immediately jump to mind when we think of the disciplines that we have at our disposal to understand environmental problems. But in fact, our current global series of crises are ultimately the product of human behavior. And human behavior is going to have to change to correct that. And psychology is very good at understanding human behavior. So we were asked, why don't humans respond relative to the magnitude of the threat? So here in my psychology hat, I'd throw out, that question is based on the sort of wrong premise that we behave rationally, that in our day-to-day interpretations and choices and decisions, that we actually weigh the pros and cons and the short-term versus long-term benefits and what the cost of things will be to us. Actually, humans don't do that at all. Just like Spock said, frankly, that's not logical. We aren't logical, but we're extremely predictable. One well-known social psychologist says we're predictably irrational. Now, that's not trying to sound glib about human beings, because psychology really defines itself as being a helping discipline. But I have to tell you, knowing that human beings are predictably irrational is the reason why, and many of you may not know this, one of sort of the dark secrets of psychology is that psychology founded advertising over 100 years ago, because being able to persuade people to take initial action has big ramifications for their behavior downstream. And in a very recent past few years, communities of psychologists have started to ask, maybe it's time to go back from the dark side and in times of crisis do what disciplines ought to do, which is give themselves away. And maybe it's time, for example, for psychology to give itself away in the aid of conservation and sustainable behavior. And this whole area has become known as conservation psychology, using our understanding of the principles that guide human behavior to persuade and guide and reinforce people's efforts to change their behavior in a sustainable direction. And you know what? If we can do it to promote consumer behavior, we can do it to promote sustainable behavior. It's been exceedingly successful to promote consumer behavior. Do I have a couple of minutes? 1 minute? 2 minutes? Okay, I'll just give you an example. Low-techy, low-tech. We might ask, why does one person stand and look at an enormous oversized truck and think, what a waste of money? And another person stands and looks at the exact same situation and thinks, you know, that's part of being a good Canadian, right? Why do we look at the same thing and see completely different things? Well, what we know is that people's emotions and behavior are very much a function of their moment-to-moment appraisals and interpretations. And these interpretations, how we interpret every single successive moment-to-moment experience we have, are very much a function of sort of implicit beliefs that we hold about the world that most of us aren't even aware that we hold. There's different psychological words for these beliefs, schemas. There's different schools of thought call them different things. Same basic idea, though. And schemas are the result of experience. Especially early experience, especially emotionally loaded experience. That's why there's a lot of data sort of kicking around about advertising dollars. Joel Bakken has just written a book about this. But just some hard data that I actually was able to track down from the Federal Trade Commission in the United States. In 2006, $1.6 billion was spent marketing food and beverages to children under age 17. And that doesn't count the about $680 million in promotional toys that went along with it. Now, why would people spend that kind of money to get kids hooked into trying a product? Because it's this. And if you can get people in there doing that, it gets incorporated into this. And if you can just fix that, people don't even question the rest of it. We go on autopilot, all of us do. So there are concrete ways that we can do this in a more sustainable direction. And maybe some specific ideas of that we'll have time to talk about when we do more of a roundtable panel give and take. Thanks.